Hey guys, welcome back. In our last video we talked about why and how the American colonists won their independence during the American Revolution, and today in this video we're going to take a look at some of the revolutionary ideals and why they were so influential and what effects those ideals had. So let's get into it. Number one, our first guiding question is going to be, how did the American Revolution affect society? Well, let's begin by looking at African Americans as a people involved in this war. Now, it's important to note that black colonists fought on both sides of the war. Okay, you had black colonists who were loyal to King George and loyal to the British, who fought on the side of the British. You also, of course, had patriots, black patriots, who fought on the side of our independence. And so, just like whites, blacks didn't have exactly a universal idea on what should be done in this war. They're affected by it, again, both ways. One way in particular I want to mention is this thing called Dunmore's Proclamation. So this happens very early in the Revolution. The British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues this proclamation basically saying that if you come and fight for us, and by us I mean the British, of course, you'll be granted your freedom in exchange for service. And you can imagine how tempting that would have been for slaves to run away and then join up with the British, knowing that once the war is over, they would get their freedom. So no doubt this would have been, again, very tempting. All right, post-war. What happens post-war for African Americans in the colonies now, I guess states will call them? Well, a lot of northern states simply abolished slavery, because slavery was never a huge deal in a lot of northern states anyways. But it's not that true equality was the result. Okay, laws still discriminated against blacks, whether they're free or slave, both in the North and the South. Now, of course, life was better in the North, but again, it's not total equality either. Here's a map. You can see the states that abolished slavery, what year they did so. Vermont, for example, did it during the Revolution. Massachusetts at the end of the Revolution, for example. These states here gradually emancipated slavery, and then these states down here, there could be individual cases of emancipation, but not full-scale emancipation. So why do you think the Founding Fathers didn't pursue the abolition of slavery more forcefully? I mean, what better time would it have been, right? We're starting a new country. This is the perfect time to hit the reset button and say, we're not doing slavery anymore. This is nonsense. They could have. They didn't. Why? Well, a lot of Founding Fathers had very conflicted feelings about this. Generally speaking, most Founding Fathers felt that a fight over slavery would lead to some sort of disunion. In other words, America is just too fragile in its infant state to take on the big, divisive, emotional issue of slavery. And then, of course, they were Founding Fathers who had a personal interest in it, and that they owned slaves themselves. And they may not have wanted to see what they saw as property be taken away from them. James Madison, future President James Madison, famously said about this, "Great as the evil is," that's a reference to slavery, "a dismemberment of the Union would be worse." Now, from his perspective, that's true. From a slave's perspective, probably not true. Like they would much rather the Union be dismembered and then get the freedom, right? They don't want to continue being enslaved just to perpetuate the Union. All right, now let's move on to the topic of greater democracy. So in a lot of states post-revolution, you're going to see voting rights expanded. What had been maybe some rather strict property requirements for suffrage are going to be reduced, in some cases even eliminated. The practice of indentured servitude is going to finally be put to rest. That's gone. And in a lot of states going forward, there will be a legal separation of church and state. All right, what about women? What is going on in terms of societal changes for them? Well, let's look at their wartime contributions first. Number one, women, while they may not have been on the front lines fighting, they certainly did contribute to the war, whether that's cooking food for the soldiers, whether it's nursing and tending to wounds from the soldiers, or sometimes just accompanying their husbands or brothers or whatever around as the army, just to kind of provide comfort there as a presence. And those women who didn't go off with their husband to war would stay behind and continue running the family business, continue running the family farm, and basically keeping the economy running still. So this is not exactly Rosie the Riveter, but it's kind of the same thing, right? Men go off to fight the war, women have to keep the economy going, otherwise you can't fight the war. Now, once the war is over, we're going to see the rise of something we refer to as Republican motherhood. And Republican motherhood was this idea that women had a special place in American society. This special place revolved around the family, that they were the keepers of the national conscience, that they are the ones who are going to teach the next generation Republican values. So in other words, it's the woman's responsibility to produce this home that is loving and caring and patriotic, and will produce good, upstanding, productive citizens. Again, Republican motherhood, it's known as. All right, so now we're going to move on to our second guiding question and look at some global impacts of the American Revolution. So our victory in the Revolution and the ideals that sort of pushed us to the Revolution in the first place sent off shockwaves around the world, because if you saw somebody else do something you wanted to do, you might decide, hey, this can be done. And it might inspire you to try your own war for independence. And you can see the map, it's just full of these. We're going to look at France first. So remember, France had helped us in our revolution. Their money and supplies were instrumental in helping us win. But there were some big problems back in France, okay? And you can see all the causes of the French Revolution here. And one of those was the debt brought on by their helping of us. So that's the economic crisis that's being referred to on this chart over here. Anyways, all this culminates, guys, with the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, and the unleashing of a very bloody revolution that will eventually topple the monarchy and result in the execution of King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette, if you recall, he had helped us in our revolution. He went back to France, and he was one of the leaders of the early part of their revolution as well. He's going to write something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. We'll talk about that in a second. And he also sent this to George Washington. So if you ever go to Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's plantation home outside of Washington, D.C., there's a key that's on the wall there in Mount Vernon. That key is to the Bastille. So that moment where the French Revolution started, that's a relic of that. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man, authored by the Marquis de Lafayette, it really mirrors a lot of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. It talks about how French people are born and will remain equal before the law. It refers to natural rights like liberty and resistance to oppression and free speech and freedom of religion. And it touches on a lot of the things that we see in our Declaration of Independence and also our later Constitution. As I said a few moments ago, King Louis XVI will be executed in 1793, and France then moves into a republic. So Americans saw the French example as kind of flattering, that they had done the same thing that we did. They became a republic. Meanwhile, a French colony called Saint-Domingue, we know it better as Haiti today, also saw a revolution take place. And on this French colony of Saint-Domingue, these slaves outnumbered non-slaves 10-1, and they eventually rise up in a revolution in 1791, and ultimately Haiti will break away and become an independent republic. Again, one of the things that motivates these rebels, it's not just about securing freedom and ending slavery, it's also the fact they're inspired by the American example and the Enlightenment that sparked our revolution as well. And the example of Haiti was something that some Americans cheered while others panicked, because think about Let's just take the example of South Carolina. Remember, in South Carolina, there were far more slaves than there were non-slaves. And so the example of Haiti is something that freaked Southern Americans out, Southern white Americans anyways, because they saw this as we could be next. There could be another Haitian-type revolution here in America. All right, you can see Latin America. Down there's going to be revolutions against the Spanish and the Portuguese, largely as a result of our revolution and Enlightenment ideas, all flowing southward. And by the 1830s, pretty much all of Latin America had gained independence through warfare and negotiation. All right, guys, that was it. So we looked first at some societal changes. We looked at how black colonists fought on both sides of the revolution. We looked at Dunmore's proclamation, which gave a very tempting offer of freedom in exchange for fighting for the British side for male slaves. We looked at how women were affected through Republican motherhood and their contributions to the war effort itself. We also looked at the global impact of the American Revolution, whether it be in France or Haiti or Latin America. So that's it. Now that we have our independence and we've looked at the impact of the independence movement, we need to start looking at the government that's going to come out of the revolution.